Hi, this is Pastor Wade Johnston at Resurrection Lutheran Church here in Milwaukee on Howard Avenue, just off Howell, where we celebrate the divine service every Sunday at 9 a.m. And this video just continues in our series on the divine service as we now are in the liturgy of the Word, and we've had our first lesson, which we talked about is normally from the Old Testament, and our psalm of the day from the great hymn book of the Christian church, from which Christ himself prayed, and these psalms which he himself fulfilled and quoted so often in his ministry. And now we are at the second lesson, which sometimes you may hear called the epistle lesson, because it's almost always from an epistle. And so what is an epistle? The epistles in the New Testament are simply letters. If we think of the Old Testament and associate it with the prophets, God's prophecies, his promises of Christ to come, and then we think of the Holy Gospel that is to come, which is about the life and words and works of Jesus, the fulfillment of those prophecies. The epistles are commentaries, so to speak, on the Old Testament and the New Testament as they look at the Old Testament and the Gospels, that is, and try to say, okay, how do we apply this? What is it exactly that we are to believe from these things? That is, what do they teach? And what are the things that we are to do according to those things? That is, what do they say about the Christian life? Some epistles build on other epistles. That's why I said the New Testament and not just the Gospels before. Some epistles are very early, and they're simply building upon the Gospels. That is the stuff that ended up in the Gospels, the accounts of what Jesus had said and done and what he had fulfilled. The epistles then can sometimes be a little bit harder to preach on than, say, a narrative from the Gospel or the Old Testament. But they're very important for the life of the church as they tell us what it is that we believe, teach, and practice what we should do together. The man who wrote the most of the epistles, most of the letters in the New Testament, is St. Paul. And so we often hear words from St. Paul at this time. And a good way to approach the epistles is to read them in the light of the Old Testament lesson and the gospel. How do they apply to both? And then to ask, what do they say to me and to my church and to my church body? As most of these epistles were written to very specific churches about very specific situations, but not only for those churches. In fact, we know Paul, for instance, it seems, kept copies of these epistles so he could share them with others. And in his epistles, he encourages the churches that receive them to circulate them. So Paul and the apostles were very cognizant that they were writing for a much broader audience than just the immediate recipient of the epistles. After the epistle lesson, the second lesson, we will then have the verse of the day, which we'll talk about next time. And then we will rise. We will rise for the Holy Gospel, which if you have a Bible that has red letter verses in it, and some people are a fan of that, some are not, right? The Holy Gospel records the actual words and works of Christ. But the epistle is an important bridge, as it reminds us that both the prophets and the apostles are speaking to us still today, to the church of all time, and that we're to take both the Old Testament promises and the gospel fulfillments and then apply them and to use them both to systematize, to put together what we confess as Christians, but also to guide our lives to apply how we live together. Hope if you're able to, you'll join us sometime for a divine service again here Sundays at 9 a.m. If you already have a church home, I hope that you can continue to grow in your appreciation for the divine service there, as this is where God comes to give us his good gifts and to speak to us still today. Until next time, God bless.